somebody had to do it, and it's gonna have to be me. So I watched an old video of Captain Jack, pretty famous YouTuber in my opinion. I personally like his work. Doing a battle between the UNSC Infinity, a much smaller version, and a Imperial Star Destroyer. Now, the Star Destroyer lost. It lost handily. But upon watching the comments for the video, I realized something. That was something that I didn't really want to think about at the time, but it's no less true. The UNSC Infinity would stand no actual chance against a regular Star Destroyer. I know that statement seems rather odd and more than a little biased, but it actually comes from a very logical source. First and foremost, fairly standardized. It uses standard weaponry. Its greatest weapon is the Supermax, which are magnetic accelerator cannons that essentially fire a almost ship-sized slug at, like, supposedly 1/4 of light speed. Not to mention the fact that the UNSC Infinity is absolutely enormous, dwarfing a Star Destroyer by many attitudes of scale. So much so that the closest approximation I could get, well, not the closest approximation, but comparatively, this is what the UNSC Infinity would look like compared to, say, my Assault Star Destroyer, the Zillifer. The UNSC Infinity would be 5,000 meters long, 5,500 at its longest. The Zillifer would be about 2,000, 1,900, give or take, so a little less than half its total length. This is not a true-to-scale variant, but it's as close as I could reasonably get because of the limits of space engineers. So you can see how much bigger the UNSC Infinity would be when compared to a Star Destroyer. Actually, come to think of it, I think I have a Star Destroyer small enough to make a more accurate comparison. Yes, I want to delete the selected object. Okay, that's the Zillifer gone. So I've got this Star Destroyer. Is this it? No, that's not it. Okay, let's see here. Okay. This would probably be a closer approximation to the size of a Imperial Star Destroyer when compared to the UNSC Infinity. It'd take about 5 of these, a little less than 5, a little over 5, to make up the entire length of this ship. So, that means that the UNSC Infinity would absolutely curb stomp these. that a Star Destroyer would have no chance whatsoever of even harming this ship. No. Unfortunately. You see, I came to realize something. The Supermax that the UNSC Infinity uses wouldn't actually hurt a Star Destroyer. That's a rather strange thing to say, since each one of these rounds is traveling at 1/4 the speed of light and hits with enough kinetic force to vaporize whatever it hits. And Star Destroyers are notoriously weak against solid shapes. Except they're not. You see, a Star Destroyer's shields work against the kinetic weapons of the UNSC Infinity. All of them, in fact. And the fact is, the UNSC Infinity would only get one shot to take out this Star Destroyer before it moves into a position where the Supermax can no longer target it. The long and short being that after it fails to destroy it with the Supermax, none of the UNSC Infinity's other weapons have any chance of harming a Star Destroyer. And the fact is, a normal Mac cannon also cannot penetrate a Star Destroyer's armor. The reason being, if you watch Episode 1, a Durasteel door is closed, and Qui-Gon Jinn stabs his lightsaber into it, melting his way through. Well, here's the thing. We see a lightsaber cut through at least a... let's see, a 12-inch thick metal door without any problems. But it has trouble melting through the Durasteel door of the bridge of the Looser Hulk. So much so that Qui-Gon has to stab it in there and leave it there, effectively being disabled for the entire time he's attempting to melt through the door. And all they do is shut a secondary door. That shows that the Durasteel armor of a Star Destroyer could survive a direct hit unshielded from the Supermac. Because the Supermac would hit the armor and deflect. Because it's a solid round. Now, the Star Destroyer would probably be thrown off course. And if it hit the bridge, well, the bridge of the Star Destroyer would probably just be instantly vaporized, because it's not held on by very much, and the rounds the Supermac fires are very, very big. But if it hits anywhere on the main hull of the Star Destroyer, the Supermac rounds will actually deflect off into space because of how it's angled. Meaning, unless you hit this upper superstructure or the bridge, the Supermac and even the regular Mac cannons are going to deflect rather than penetrate. This is because of how durable Durasteel actually is. Which means that none of the secondary weapons, cannons, missiles, none of that would have any chance of penetrating a Star Destroyer's armor if the Supermax can't even do it. That's why I say that the UNSC Infinity actually has no chance against the Star Destroyer. Now, the thing about the Star Destroyer's weaponry is every turbo laser is basically a Supermac firing a miniature sun at the target. Because the superheated plasma of the Tibanna gas is super compressed into a solid shot, which essentially becomes the core of a dwarf star, which is then fired out of a magnetic accelerator cannon, which is the barrel, into the target. The fact is, the Star Destroyer's reason being, if a Star Destroyer misses the target, there is a lot of inhabited planets in Star Wars, well-known inhabitable planets. Several of them have civilizations that are very important to the Republic. So if you fire a miniature star and miss, and that miniature star travels into another solar system and hits one of and kills millions of people because you missed a shot, there's going to be a lot of repercussions. The Infinity doesn't have that problem because humanity just doesn't care. If the Supermac misses the Star Destroyer, and the Star Destroyer is situated between the Infinity and Earth, and the UNSC Infinity fires a Supermac, misses the Star Destroyer, and hits Earth, no one really seems to care. So the Supermac is actually a artificially reduced nature of Star Wars as opposed to the UNSC, who just fires Mac cannons willy-nilly and doesn't really care if they blow up the entire universe because, oh well, we're still alive. Secondly, Mac cannons tend to penetrate their targets, meaning the round again continues indefinitely until it hits something with sufficient mass to stop it, which is usually a planet, or a star, or a black hole. So in reality, the Star Destroyer would be able to easily penetrate the titanium armor of the UNSC Infinity. It would take a long time. You'd need probably an entire fleet of Star Destroyers to actually defeat the UNSC Infinity. Because as long as its Forerunner shields keep coming up, they're going to have to punch through the shields and then deal more damage to the hull. By sheer size, each shot from the Star Destroyer is only going to the hull. That's what they're designed to do. They're designed for armor penetration. They basically fire a miniature star that melts its way through the hull of the ship, and depending on the turbo laser, can explode inside, but mostly they're just designed to expend all of their... The UNSC Infinity has to stop lasers. Those lasers are very, very strong, but nowhere near as strong as basically magnetically accelerating a miniature star into your ship. Turbo lasers are incredibly powerful. They are not a joke. They are not a joke weapon. They will vaporize anything they hit if it's small enough. That's why starfighters tend to explode in Star Wars when they get hit by one, and why they only ever need one shot to destroy them. But that's because Star Wars technology is designed around the turbo laser. Though, in reality, the turbo lasers are weak when confronted against Star Wars ships, which are specifically Covenant weaponry. And the Covenant weaponry is nowhere near as powerful as a turbo laser. Logically primitive comparatively. The fact is, an entire UNSC fleet has no hope whatsoever of defeating the Death Star, because none of the Supermacs will be able to penetrate its armor. None of the Mac cannons will be able to penetrate its armor, whereas the Star Destroyer can fire back at them and pierce every single ship in the fleet. And then it just charges its super laser and destroys the UNSC Infinity in one shot. That's the significant difference between these two ships. It's the significant difference between Star Wars and just about anything else, in fact. We have severely, and I do mean severely, underestimated the firepower of the Empire and of Star Wars in general. If the UNSC Infinity were to go up against a Warhammer ship, a similar event would happen, because the Warhammer ships are specifically designed to resist the impacts of a weapon as primitive as the Supermac. Yes, the Supermac is actually very primitive comparatively. The Tau railguns are actually superior by many levels to the Supermacs that are used in Halo. The Supermac is an extremely weak, extremely fragile weapon. and takes an extremely long time to reload and refire. Thus, there is a high probability that it will be dead before it can ever fire a second shot from them. Now, that's not to say that the UNSC Infinity cannot defeat a Star Destroyer. The reality is, it has every capability of defeating a Star Destroyer. It really does. If it gets a shot against the back of the Star Destroyer, say its engine bay, very good chance that it will one-shot the Star Destroyer with minimal effort. That is, if the Star Destroyer shields do not, which is highly possible if they redirect their ray shields to the rear of the ship. See, the problem is, any shot from these Supermax from long range will be deflected by the ships. And fighters have to get so close is so they can get inside the ray shield and fire their weapons. They have to be in the shield, otherwise the shield blocks their weapons. That's why you don't see long-range artillery bombardments from solid kinetic weapons against Star Destroyers. Because their ray shields will effectively block them. That's the whole point of them being equipped with them. Now, that's, again, not to say that there's no way that the UNSC Infinity can defeat a Star Destroyer, because, again, if it uses its hangar bays properly and successfully manages to pierce the enemy ship, blowing a hole in it, using its bombers or assorted other vessels, or deploying its auxiliary ships to soak up fire, so it can slip jump behind the Star Destroyer and then fire its Supermax into its undefended rear, then yes, there are tactical ways the Infinity could defeat a Star Destroyer. But the problem is, the Star Destroyer does not have to use tactics to defeat the UNSC Infinity. All it has to do is shoot it until the Infinity stops working. Which, considering the Infinity's design, could take a very, very long time. But still, it would be a much shorter time and much less difficult than it would be for the Infinity to do the same thing to a Star Destroyer. All of its kinetic weapons would do no damage. They would not have the penetrative power necessary to breach the Durasteel hull of a Star Destroyer. However, every turbo laser on the Star Destroyer would be able to punch through the 5.9 meter thick titanium armor of the UNSC Infinity. Even the light turbo lasers, because we already know that a standard X-Wing laser, which is much, much smaller than a turbo laser of even the smallest variety, can punch through titanium armor, because that's what a TIE fighter is made out of. TIE fighters have titanium armor. So against a Super Star Destroyer, the UNSC Infinity would actually not even be able to harm it. The Supermax would bounce off its external armor, its weapons would have no effect on any part of it, and the Super Star Destroyer would just literally pull up next to it and just keep firing until the Infinity stops working. No amount of fighters that it could deploy would be comparable to the TIE fighters deployed by the Super Star Destroyer or even the regular Star Destroyer. So all in all, the UNSC Infinity actually stands zero, and I do mean zero, chance of defeating even one Executor-class Super Star Destroyer, and even less of a chance of defeating a Mon Calamari cruiser, which have very, very good shields. The Supermax is not as powerful as we make it out to be. It is actually